Week 10, History 425. Let's get to it. Go please to slide 3. This lecture focuses on the problems of China that the government has today and that the people have today. And most of it is based on things that you read about in the second half of the McGregor book. I highly recommend that you take a close look at the McGregor book before you attempt to do the final, partly because the second half of the McGregor book especially includes, well, the first half does too. All through that book, there is mention of major events in PRC history, that is the history of China since 1949. That is what this final focuses on. And McGregor discusses not only the events, but also the effects of those events on the people and the government and the foreign relations of China. This includes things like the party's obsession with controlling history. And all you have to do to find that in the McGregor book is to look in the index under that word history, and you'll find references to it. The thing you've got to do, though, is not only read carefully parts of the book that you find by perusing the index, but also you've got to make sure that you read as much of the book as you can, because he has a very easy and narrative style. He does not cover things strictly section by section, bit by bit. He sort of weaves in and out of topics. And if you try to just selectively read a little bit here and a little bit there, you'll miss quite a bit. It's a very easy book to read, in my opinion. It's written better, I think, than any of the other readings you've had so far. It's very accessible. So please take a good look at the McGregor book. It also includes background on people that you've been exposed to previously in the course, people like Lee Ray. If you recall the uploaded parts of the film Morning Sun, there are parts where Lee Ray is interviewed and his daughter is interviewed, whose family name is also Lee. I don't recall her full name. It's in the McGregor book. There's a good review of his background, why he was so important, the sorts of things that he has been doing lately to criticize the regime, why he's left alone, why the media outlets that carry his comments aren't left alone, and so on. It's all explained very well, and I highly recommend you take a close look at McGregor. One thing I want to mention too that I know isn't in the rest of the lecture that might clarify things for you a bit is that you'll see mention of both the CCP propaganda department, that is the propaganda arm of the party, and you'll see mention of the Ministry of Propaganda, which is under the State Council, which is part of the government. What's the diff? The difference is that the CCP propaganda department under the under the party, is the part of the whole organization of the government and party, the part that makes the policy. So overall policy, comparatively high policy is made by the CCP propaganda department, part of the party, but the Ministry of Propaganda is subordinate to it. It's under the State Council, it's part of the government, and it carries out those decisions from the propaganda department. So the rules that are issued every week to all the media outlets in China about what to cover and what to ignore, because it's too sensitive, come from the Ministry of Propaganda. They take care of all that detail work, in other words. The propaganda department, however, sets the standards and enforces them. Okay, so looking now at slide 3, we've been through quite a bit of this already in the course. We've talked about how land has been grabbed in both the cities and the countryside, and how this has been part of the problem that's caused a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and how this has produced a housing bubble, because as there's more and more money in society among some people, naturally that means that when they want to buy a house they can pay more, and the people who don't have these higher sources of income, the people with less money naturally are frozen out of the housing market. Inflation has been a major problem also in the last 10 years. It's tended to be between 5 and 8% per year, which is very significant. And it's gone along with the high growth that is usually between 7 and 9% over the past 20 years. And part of this, of course, has been, as we've previously discussed, this turn toward capitalism, this building up of state-owned enterprises that are favored, the ones that they're picked out because they're the most successful, that the decision makers in the state and party want to grow as quickly as possible. So these have become the main driving force of the economy, and they're again state-owned. And part of the justification for this is that the party is claiming that socialism means state ownership instead of the old definition of socialism, which included worker ownership of the means of production. In other words, the workers own the machines in the factory, and they get most of the money from what the factory makes. Now it's the state. If the state owns most of everything, then we have socialism. So this has created some problems, and in these two photos here, this is just an example from the northeastern city of Dalian. I picked it because I recently lived there. In Dalian, the problem that has caused all this public dissatisfaction is that these major businesses, petrochemical business that makes this paraxylene stuff that's used in plastics manufacturing, and a very large oil refinery that's right on the water near a tourist resort, which is part of the source of income for the local residents. These businesses are not only owned, but they're regulated by the local government, an obvious conflict of interest. So what does that mean? That means that the regulation of these businesses is virtually non-existent. There are only changes made when there's public outrage. Otherwise, the business is run for the benefit of the business itself. There's very little oversight. This is a central problem in the economy as more and more capital is finding its way to these state-owned businesses. They're not actually effectively regulated by the government because the government, senior government officials have not only interest but controlling interest in these businesses. We'll get into more of those problems when we get into the corruption section. Let's go on to slide 4. So more and more state-owned firms are moving capital overseas, and this is a subject of some amount of discussion in the West. And indeed, if there's another table I might have put on this slide that shows the amount of Chinese capital invested outside of China going straight up in around 2006 to 2011, and rising ever higher since then. But you have to keep these things in perspective. It's true that The places you see on this map, for example, which comes from the mainstream conservative Heritage Foundation, are the places where there is a lot of Chinese investment. But the actual amount invested by China is not all that great compared to other countries in the world, as I've made clear in these bullets. It's simply more than it used to be. And it's only natural that it should be more than it used to be, because the Chinese have only in the last 15 years built up this reserve of foreign currency that they have based on their success as an exporting nation. That success is coming to an end, as you'll read about in McGregor. Things are changing. You'll especially read about that if you follow China in outlets like the New York Times. So one has to keep these things in perspective. It isn't necessarily all that sinister. Going on to slide 5. This makes these things, not only in the economic realm, but in the military realm, make people think that China is trying to expand its power overseas. And indeed, in the area near the periphery of the PRC, there is expansion. We read every week about China's disagreements with its neighbors in Southeast Asia and with Japan over the nearby islands which have oil resources. But you have to stop and ask at the same time, as you worry about these things, what are the Chinese doing that's different than any other country would be doing probably under these circumstances? It's not that it's necessarily fair, it's not that it's necessarily good or bad, but I would argue that it's normal for a country, especially that is rising as a power, to seek to control the resources that are close by, especially since they've been making claims about those resources for decades, something that's often ignored in Western media accounts about these disputes. So it's true that the Chinese are trying to control the waters nearby China, partly because they want to have the option of invading Taiwan someday. And that's the sort of thing that I think people outside of China would agree is bad, because people on Taiwan don't want to be controlled by China. And a war like that would create severe economic dislocation in the world economy. However, these things are, I would say, to be expected. They're not necessarily sinister. They are simply the realities of how nations react or how they behave under circumstances like this. But the bottom line there is that it's necessary to remember that there's some amount of diplomatic work that needs to be done in order to avoid problems. Let's go on to slide 6. So, speaking of conflicts with other nations, history and the perception that the perceptions of history by the Chinese population are very important to not only foreign relations, but also to how the government and the party get along with the people themselves. And this it's not a particularly Chinese problem, because all you have to do is try to compare how the American Civil War is taught in Massachusetts versus how in the high schools in Massachusetts versus how it's taught in high schools in Mississippi. There's a great difference there. They aren't even called the same thing. In the North, it's called the Civil War. In the South, it's called the war between the states. And there are many different ways to emphasize the issues that led to the conflict and the issues that resulted after the conflict was finished. And indeed, in China, this is also a problem. However, though it's not a particularly Chinese problem, every country has its issues with how its history is taught. The intensity of this problem and the perception by the government and the ruling party of how historical sensibilities can affect the stability of the society is particularly acute in China, I have to say. And part of it is from history itself. 1,500 years ago, during the Qin dynasty, the first dynasty to 2,000 years ago, really, to unify China, all the records were destroyed from the previous era. And indeed, this is the sort of thing that has happened more or less as China has more recently changed governments in the nationalist era and the beginning of the communist era. McGregor talks about how the Chinese Communist Party wants to avoid competing narratives. That is, they want everybody to believe the version of history that is the official Chinese Communist Party version. And part of the reason for this is the legitimacy of the party itself now in this very unusual period when a Communist Party has turned away from its socialist roots and is focused instead on another kind of economic system, as we discussed last week, this authoritarian capitalism that it's pursuing now. And because the party has let go of its previous way of legitimizing itself, that it was overthrowing an old economic system that had exploited poor people, and it was making the workers and the peasants masters of Chinese society. That's seemingly less legitimate than it used to be. And so now the party is concerned to make sure it controls the narrative of history so that there is no question that it is a legitimate governing force in China today. Part of the sensitivity lies in the way the party has always tied its legitimacy to Chairman Mao, and how the ideas about Chairman Mao and what mistakes he made and when he made them is also a sensitive topic, because if one can freely criticize what Mao did at different times of history, then one might want to take the next step and freely criticize what the party has done after Mao died in 1976, particularly what the party did in 1989 when the crackdown against the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square occurred. And in McGregor, he mentions that two of the leaders of that period who participated in the crackdown, Li Peng and Yang Shangkun, had relayed to people in private that the party would eventually have to re-examine the verdicts about the so-called counter-revolutionary activity that led to the June 4th, 1989 massacre. That would be a big deal because it would indicate that the party is not correct. They often call themselves the correct Communist Party of China. That there are potential problems with some of the major decisions of the party in the latest era, in the modern era. That would be a problem. Going on to slide 7. So if you'd like to take a break here and look at a few videos, when you click on these, you have to click back after you look at each one in order to return to this presentation, if you're viewing it on D2L. If you're just viewing it from the email I intend to send out with attachments, then that won't be such a problem. But you take a look at these short videos, and then if you think about how this sort of spoof about high-ranking political figures in the West is normal in the West. But then you stop and think about how if you were caught looking at this sort of thing in China, you could end up in jail, or how if you were identified by the Chinese government as somebody who posted these things online, then you'd never get a visa to China. You'd be denied a visa. In other words, the sensitivity of the Chinese government and party is very high regarding this sort of this silly kind of criticism. Then you begin to realize how sensitive the party is about its history, and indeed, hundreds of millions of Chinese, if they were to look at these videos and understand what was being said in the videos through subtitles, then a lot of people would laugh, but an awful lot of people would also be absolutely incensed, and if they were surrounding a foreigner they knew had been responsible for it, they might just kill him. And I'm not kidding. This is the way people react to these problems in China. History is a real big problem. Going on to slide 8. Corruption. Predictions that by party conservatives like Chen Yun, that all this opening up jazz back in the mid and late 1980s would lead to corruption certainly came true. There was corruption under Mao Zedong. Absolutely. It's just that it has ballooned decade by decade since the passing of the chairman. When the party decided to begin privatizing state-held assets in order to weed out unprofitable enterprises, they sold them off to party insiders or their relatives at very low prices. These new owners then turned around, they laid off a lot of workers, probably in many enterprises retooling with loans from the state, loans from state banks that were made at the behest of the local party committee, on their orders, that is. Often these loans are not paid back, or the properties were sold later to foreign interests at a windfall. Such activities would never have been specifically approved by the central government, but the point is that Beijing did not try to keep control of these sales of state-owned assets by local party committees. The local officials were often quite corrupt and pursued selfish interests at the expense of the public. And indeed, as I mentioned earlier, senior party officials have been tied to these problems. Senior party officials have been tied to factories in South China that produce pirated music and so on and so forth. Just a very quick story. You can see these telephone numbers on the wall with the Banzheng arrange official identification card for you. These are advertisements. You see this all over China because people who come in from the countryside to work in the cities have to be able to show that they are legal in the cities, and so they get fake IDs to show that they have legal residency in a city so they're not hassled by authorities. One time I called up one of these numbers just for laughs, and I said, in Chinese, I said, "I'm a foreigner, and I'd like an ID card that says I'm from Xinjiang, because I have dark hair and I look like I'm from Xinjiang. I want a Chinese ID." And the guy says, "Just a minute." And then he goes and talks. "Okay, we can do it." "Okay, how much do you want?" "Just a minute." He goes back and he comes back and says, 400 yuan. 400 renminbi, which is like, at the time it was like $50. So for $50 I could have had a fake ID, and I suppose I could have gotten a job that was reasonably good in a big Chinese city. Anyway, we'll continue on slide 9 in audio 2.